Is not a problem this time around for any of the Space Shuttle Columbia's crew. NASA conducting a study on the queasiness that has plagued previous shuttle astronauts. KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino is down at the Johnson Space Center again this morning and has a live report.
Wouldn't you know it, on previous flights, motion sickness has cropped up almost every time. It even caused delays in experiments during Shuttle Mission 3 when Lausma and Fullerton battled with nausea. This time, NASA doctors wanted to study the queasiness question, but the crew on this perfect flight simply won't get sick. The guinea pig this morning after a big breakfast was mission specialist Joe Allen.
We have a good record of what we've done on board, so we can decipher later if it's not patently obvious when you first look at it.
Okay, we copy MS-21 and stand by, and I'll see if everybody understands that.
And Roy, since I lived through it, Bill's agreed to do it also, so he'll be doing it next.
There was another sign of how smooth things are going on Shuttle Mission 5. For the first time in the shuttle program, the flight plan for the day went upstairs unchanged. The deployment of the Canadian satellite scheduled for later this afternoon. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Is now turning its attention to student experiments aboard the shuttle. The crew has been awake for over 4 hours now, and the flawless flight continues without problems. KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino is standing by with a live report.
The wake-up call came early at 2:15 a.m. The 76 trombones went on for a few moments, and when the serenade was over, the crew got down to a big breakfast. There's been no problems with motion sickness so far. A little funny since NASA's performing experiments to study queasiness. The targets this morning, specialists Lenore and Allen. Allen was the first to go, and he survived. The student experiments to study sponges and crystals have been activated. Later today, the crew will do some exercise, then make an orbital maneuver, getting ready for the deployment of satellite number 2. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
6:30.
Andropov succeeds Brezhnev as General Secretary of Soviet Communist Party as Brezhnev lies in state. Reagan foresees no immediate change in relations. Good morning. This is Dallas Townsend with the CBS World News Roundup. The 4 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia were awakened this morning by the rousing strains of 76 trombones. And now they're embarked on another day of intense activity, reported by Judy Muller at the Johnson Space Center.
After 8 hours of reportedly sound sleep, the 4 astronauts aboard the Columbia awoke and said their good mornings to Mission Control.
Early morning for you down here in Houston, isn't it, Bob?
Boy, you couldn't tell by me. It was awful dark when we came in.
Looks like we all got a real good night's sleep last night.
Well, I hope you did. It's going to be awfully hard for you guys to top yesterday, though.
I know.
Equaling their performance of yesterday is their goal, a flawless deployment of a second communications satellite towards a permanent orbit 22,300 miles out in space. This afternoon, as the Columbia crosses the Pacific for the 22nd time, the crew will launch Telesat Canada's satellite, Anik C, from the cargo bay. Anik, which is Eskimo for little brother, is not really so little, weighing in at about 7,000 pounds at the time it's launched. After the satellite deployment, Commander Vance Brand will maneuver Columbia so its starboard side faces the sun for a 47-hour period in an experiment aimed at determining how certain systems on the craft respond to extremes of heat and cold. Judy Muller, CBS News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
Is performing beautifully, and the crew hasn't been plagued with the motion sickness that previous shuttle astronauts have suffered from. KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino is at the Johnson Space Center and has this live report.
The crew is a little curious about a master alarm that went off a short time ago on board Columbia, about a half an hour ago. They just talked to Mission Control. It only lasted a few seconds. Just talked to them and asked them if they knew anything more about it. Mission Control said no. One of the crew members, though, described what may have been the cause of it.
There was a very short 1 second or so venting sound that sounded as though it came from the vicinity of the wet trash bags here that are venting by the head here. Of course, that's down the hatch, and I guess anything down here would have sounded like it was from that vicinity.
Mission Control not very concerned about it. The astronauts aren't either. It went off. It hasn't come back on. The crew has been exercising this morning, running on the treadmill. They've been conducting motion sickness tests. NASA was hoping that perhaps one of them would get sick this time because they have experiments on board to monitor exactly what causes it. But at that kind of flight, nobody's getting sick, and things still going very, very well. After one full day, the crew performing the orbital maneuvers necessary to get them ready for the deployment of the second satellite. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
CBS News. This is Reed Collins at the Johnson Space Center near Houston, Texas. The shuttle Columbia is preparing to deploy the second of two commercial communication satellites. This, the Canadian product called Anik C. Anik means little brother in Eskimo. The procedure is much the same as yesterday's when the American SBS was sprung from the cargo bay. The mission specialist in charge of today's deployment is Joe Allen. The satellite will be spun at 50 revolutions per minute, then released, and 45 minutes later its own engine will fire up toward its 22,000-mile parking spot. Once it's out of the cargo bay, NASA's responsibility ends, and the shuttle will have earned another $9 million for the space agency, its second commercial paycheck, all coming up in the next half hour over the Pacific Ocean. Chris Kelly will have more news from New York after this message.
Looking forward to your TV at that time.
Okay, Brian. We'll scramble to get it set up.
And that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing right now, scrambling to get the TV set up, scrambling to get the satellite in place. We're going to know about 30 minutes from now whether it actually is kicking out into space and doing what it's supposed to do. If it works, this Canadian satellite should provide direct satellite-to-home communications, television communication, that is, in the remotest corners of Canada. We'll be back about 30 minutes from now to tell you whether or not that satellite actually is in the orbit where it's supposed to be. Reporting live from the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Mutual News. Yuri Off, the former chief.
Already been sent out, but the shuttle's been out of touch with Earth for the past 15 or 20 minutes, so we don't know whether or not it's actually been sent away from the spacecraft. We're going to find that out about 10 minutes from now, as soon as they come back into or 10 seconds from now, when they come back into communication with the ground. We're seeing some wonderful television pictures of it, though.
Now over Santiago, Chile.
We're about to hear from them right now. Pretty soon, NASA should be trying to make contact with the space shuttle to find out whether or not that second satellite has indeed fired on time, sprung out of the payload.
Columbia, Houston with you at Santiago, and standing by for your deploy to report.
Okay, Houston, this is Columbia. We are 2 for 2. We deliver. And we're standing by for a burn. How long will you be with us, Brian?
Roger, we have 5 minutes. We'll see the burn.
So,
okay,
as they say,
we'll give you the numbers.
they deliver. That seems to be the motto of this mission now. We deliver. They said that yesterday, right before they went to bed, and indeed they have delivered twice now. NASA has kicked satellites into space from the back of the space shuttle. So, Jim, looks like it's off. It's gotten off the second time, and pretty soon we should be seeing some pictures of that thing flying out of the payload bay of the space shuttle.
All right, so we've made $17 million on this flight. It only cost $250 million to get it off the ground, but $17 million's coming back.
Well, they're hoping in about 4 or 5 years they can start turning this thing into black. We'll see how that goes.
Would you like to say anything to Larry King while we have him here?
Hi, Larry. How you doing?
How are you?
It's a pleasure, Larry.
Well, it must be great to be down. I love being down there.
Come on down. Now, Larry, you really ought to try something. They will be flying at one point civilians on the space shuttle, and a lot of network-type people are putting in their applications already. Wouldn't it be wonderful to do a talk show from the space shuttle?
Well, I don't know if I'd want to go up.
Oh, come on.
I tell you, a surprising thing, I had Ray Bradbury on down at Disney World, a great science fiction writer who wrote Fahrenheit 451, The Martian Chronicles. Mm-hmm. And I asked him, wouldn't you like to go up in that thing going next week? He says, no way.
for Columbia. I'm Bill Stoller, and the Space Shuttle has now finished the business part of its trip. ABC's John Lyons reports Columbia has put NASA way ahead of a competing European commercial rocket.
Today, the astronauts launched the Canadian Telsat satellite. As the shuttle was out over the Central Pacific, the astronauts ordered the restraints released, and 4 springs popped the 8,000-pound communication satellite off toward its own orbit. The shuttle has now launched its first 2 paying passengers, showing prospective customers it can deliver. The European Ariane rocket was launched on its first commercial mission 2 months ago. A pump failed and it blew up before reaching orbit. The satellites burned up upon re-entering the atmosphere. John Lyons, ABC News, Johnson Space Center, Houston.
And I'll have more news coming up.
3 o'clock.
CBS News, this is Dick Reeves. Crew of the shuttle has been busy again today. In Houston, Reed Collins is keeping score.
Columbia is 2 for 2 in the satellite launching business, having successfully deployed the second commercial satellite from the cargo hold 35 minutes ago. Canada's Anik C3 satellite was spinning in its cargo cradle when the mission specialist Joe Allen reported all was ready.
We don't have a single anomaly to report. It looks beautiful to us here.
Roger, Joe. Looks good to us so far.
Over the equator, out of touch with the ground, the Anik rose spinning from the cargo bay. And when Columbia reached South America, Allen reported the result.
Okay, Houston, this is Columbia. We are 2 for 2. We deliver.
2 for 2, as Allen says of the Columbia's crew, we deliver. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center.
Nothing formal or binding, you understand, but the Commission working on Social Security reforms has tentatively agreed to include new federal workers.
Well, we'll have that report in a few minutes, if possible. It appears at the moment Houston's Metro has 125 Grumman stripped-down buses that nobody wants.
NASA's end of a $9 million deal with Telesat Canada. Anik is the name of this new bird. That means brother in Eskimo, and Eskimos in the remotest reaches of Canada should soon receive TV pictures bounced directly from to their homes from this new satellite. But first it must fire into a near geosynchronous orbit, and that's a move that's scheduled, just a few minutes from the Space Shuttle has moved away from the satellite by now so that it will not catch any of the exhaust from that rocket firing. Once again, that firing is just a couple of minutes away. The remainder of the mission after that will be left to a spacewalk. That'll be the big move on Sunday morning. That's the main part of the mission left for Sunday morning, and that'll be coming up just a couple of days from now. But first we have to find out whether or not that engine's going to fire on the Anik satellite. We'll have word on that later on this afternoon. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
CBS News, this is Dick Reeves. Like the
participating GM dealers are offering.
The latches and springs worked, and another communications satellite was planted in space, dropped into the great upstairs from the shuttle. Second one in 2 days. This time a satellite that will help bring pay TV to Canada. Ahead Sunday for the shuttle crew, a spacewalk. Dick Reeves, CBS News.
This is The World Tonight, sponsored in part by Control Data Corporation. Good evening, I'm Richard C. Hottle at CBS News. Mission Control was saying today that the Columbia Space Shuttle could not possibly duplicate its feat of yesterday when it launched its first commercial satellite so successfully. But Reed Collins reports from Houston Mission Control that they did it.
The shuttle Columbia launched its second commercial satellite on its second day in space. This one, a Canadian relay station, Anik C. Anik, the Indian word for little brother. The satellite was spinning in its cargo cradle when mission specialist Joe Allen reported all was ready.
We don't have a single anomaly to report. It looks beautiful to us here.
Roger, Joe. Looks good to us so far.
Over the equator, out of touch with the ground, Anik rose spinning from the cargo bay. And over the next ground station in South America, Allen reported the result.
Okay, Houston, this is Columbia. We are 2 for 2. We deliver.
Before long, confirmation came from Canada's tracking network.
Columbia, Houston, words from the Anik folks. The Anik spacecraft has been acquired over Guam, right where they expected to see it.
Outstanding. Very good news.
With the second successful launch, Columbia earned NASA some $17 million in commercial fees. About one-third would have cost the satellite companies to launch with either the American Delta rocket or Europe's Ariane booster. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center.
Tonight, Friday, November 12th. The World Tonight is produced by Richard Carlson with technical supervision this week by Joe.
The words of astronaut Joseph Allen after the Space Shuttle Columbia launched a second satellite from orbit to orbit today. It's a powerful Canadian communication system. And the exact...
From ABC News, I'm Bob Windsor.
The Windsor is finally freed in Poland. Moscow remains in mourning, and Vietnam veterans have their day in Washington. I'm Deborah Potter reporting on the CBS World News Roundup. Mission Control promised more later. And we get more now on the astronauts' third day in space from Reed Collins at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
The Columbia crew will spend a good part of today getting ready for tomorrow's spacewalk by Joe Allen and Bill Lenore, who plan to spend more than 3 hours outside the spacecraft. This morning, they asked for a private medical conference with doctors here at Mission Control. Each was scheduled to take a motion sickness pill on Thursday, but there's been no indication of a medical problem until now. Astronaut Robert Overmyer made an unusual revelation today.
President Brezhnev is actually wearing my silver astronaut pin.
Overmyer had been a member of the support team for the Soviet-American Apollo-Soyuz flight in 1975, and as such made several trips to Moscow.
We were at a reception, and the Soviet delegation gave the American delegation a number of items, and I took off my silver astronaut pin and gave it to Tom Stanford, who presented to the President Brezhnev.
Astronaut Overmyer recalling the days of Soviet-American cooperation in space. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center.
Mutual News. The Columbia crew, Mutual's Jim Slade reports from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
A small day in terms of the way the first two have gone. No satellite launches today, no spacewalks, just a kind of a day to catch up on the little things. There are a few experiments to perform, like student Aaron Gillette's setup, which is designed to study the effect of zero gravity on sponges and whether they can regenerate their structure in that atmosphere. Dr. Joe Allen is spending most of his spare
Union today. That's the first acknowledgement from the astronauts on the death of Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. KTRH's Doug Miller has this live report from the Johnson Space Center.
The astronauts asked for some news from home today. The ground told them that most of the news was coming from Russia. And to that, Bob Overmyer responded,
We're very sorry to hear about the death of Premier President Brezhnev, and certainly wish the Soviet people, the Russians, well on their selection process for the next premier.
The ground response was just a little bit nervous, but Overmyer passed on an interesting revelation after that. He recalled that his astronaut's pin was given to Brezhnev back during the days of Soviet-American détente. Overmyer was on the backup crew for the Apollo-Soyuz flight back in '75. He traveled to Moscow with his fellow crew members. One day, the American astronauts were given a gift from the Soviets. The Americans were apparently unprepared for that exchange of gifts, so Overmyer handed over his astronaut's pin. That's how one Space Shuttle astronaut today remembers Leonid Brezhnev. Just received a report from the medical end of this mission. The medical condition of the astronauts reported to be generally good, but one is still showing symptoms of space sickness. The motion sickness has afflicted other crews. Two of them showed it just a bit earlier. Both of them took medication. Now it's down to one, and we're expecting a further report later on this morning as to just how this is affecting the crew. But generally, once again, the crew of the Space Shuttle Columbia reported to be in good medical condition on this, what promised to be a rather slow day of the mission of Space Shuttle Columbia. Reporting live from the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
KTRH, Houston. Mutual News.
Columbia is doing its job today after launching 2 commercial satellites into orbit. Speaking with Mission Control this morning, astronaut Bob Overmyer claims his 3-mile exercise run was a world record because of the speed of the spacecraft.
I just ran the treadmill, and by my calculations, I ran about 3,600 miles
Mission Control says Hank Hartsfield had a treadmill run on the last shuttle for a distance of 8,000 miles.
Astronauts are now midway through their day, a day filled with more unusual antics and a somber comment on the death of Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. KTRH's Doug Miller has this live report.
Houston, we're standing.
Barbecued beef is on the menu. Astronaut Bob Overmeyer claiming it's just like a picnic up there.
You really feel like when you're eating, you like to get your whole body kind of restrained, like your head and shoulders, everything. I've got my feet up on about the fourth step of the ladder, and my neck jammed against the bulkhead right above ML31 Charlie. It makes a perfect place. I'm sitting there eating my barbecue beef with a kind of picnic.
Well, no long necks to go along with that barbecue. As a matter of fact, they're having trouble finding their coffee with cream on board. This morning, Overmeyer somehow managed to spew the shuttle's middeck with scrambled eggs during breakfast. Motion sickness is becoming a problem for one astronaut. No word yet on whether that's going to affect tomorrow's scheduled spacewalk. By the way, Overmeyer expressed sorrow over the death of Leonid Brezhnev today, remembering the days of Soviet-American space cooperation, when he says he gave the Russian president his astronaut's pin in exchange of gifts. A slow day ahead for the Space Shuttle astronauts today, sort of a calm before the spacewalk scheduled for tomorrow morning. Live from the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
From ABC News, I'm Don Fisher. Shuttle astronauts, having completed their commercial venture of launching 2 communication satellites, are preparing for tomorrow's spacewalk. The exercise may pave the way for a satellite to repair mission in 1984. The astronauts today also sent their condolences to the Soviet people on the death of Brezhnev. One of the astronauts reported some space sickness symptoms today, but a flight surgeon at the Mission Control in Houston said all were performing well on this third day of the mission. This is ABC News.
On the shuttle this morning, we'll tell you about that after a look at weather with forecaster Tom Ross. Elsewhere around the state, Corpus Christi reporting fair. Astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia are running into an old problem, motion sickness. KTRH's Doug Miller has this live report from Johnson Space Center.
They've had this problem before on previous missions, but this time it could affect a major objective of this Space Shuttle mission. For example, at this point, the astronauts are saying that 2 of them are experiencing some sort of a problem with motion sickness, Bob Overmeyer and Bill Lenore. And the problem is that Lenore is scheduled to walk in space tomorrow, and this could affect the EVA schedule for tomorrow. As a matter of fact, in a press briefing that's going on right now, NASA's Dr. Sam Poole and Tommy Holloway just a couple of seconds ago confirmed that the EVA could be delayed.
From the point of view of EVA, yes, we would be concerned if someone were really having a lot of symptoms of space motion sickness, and we've got to make that judgment today. And I would emphasize that there is no overriding reason why the EVA should occur tomorrow or the next day. It's just a matter of choice.
Tommy Holloway pointing out that the spacewalk could be delayed until the next day, but at this point a decision has not yet been made on whether the spacewalk will go on. In the earlier missions, NASA reports they have about a 50% incidence of motion sickness on earlier Space Shuttle missions. Once again, Overmeyer is experiencing occasional problems. Bill Lenore, though, is having apparently more serious troubles, and the medication has not helped at all. A decision is going to be made later today whether that spacewalk scheduled for tomorrow will happen on time, or indeed if it will happen at all. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
CBS News, this is Paul Lockwood. Or even calling off the spacewalk scheduled for tomorrow by 2 of the men aboard the Space Shuttle. Reed Collins has more from the Johnson Space Center in Houston. 2 of Columbia's 4 astronauts have had motion sickness. Robert Overmeyer recovered after taking medication, but Bill Lenore still was queasy and vomited today. Lenore is scheduled to take a spacewalk tomorrow morning. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sam Poole says that could present problems.
Clearly, we've given some thought to the probability and the consequences of vomiting in the suit. We know that's not a good thing to do, and I think we would want to come back inside immediately upon that occurrence.
I think we could come back inside.
Mission Control is keeping tabs on Lenore's condition and says tomorrow's spacewalk could be postponed until Monday or even canceled. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center.
Now President Reagan goes on the air with his regular weekly radio broadcast. He may announce at that time a lifting of the sanctions against the Soviet natural gas pipeline to Western Europe.
Scheduled for 2 Columbia astronauts may be postponed or even canceled. The problem is space sickness. The story comes from KTRH's Doug Miller in this live report from Johnson Space Center.
Tomorrow, 2 Columbia astronauts are scheduled to walk in space, Joe Allen and Bill Lenore. But Lenore now has motion sickness. It may be serious enough to prevent a walk in space. That leaves a few options open right now. The spacewalk could be delayed until Monday. It could be canceled entirely. Or the flight of Columbia could be extended. To that subject, Tommy Holloway, flight director, addressed himself a few moments ago in a press conference.
We have not really decided what our options are toward extending the flight to provide the opportunity to do the EVA should we need more time. That's something we'll be evaluating in the next day or so, and I'm very hopeful. In fact, I expect that I'm not going to have to worry about it.
They hope they won't have to worry about it because that would mean putting off the spacewalk at least a day. Now, a decision could be made later on this afternoon as to what to do about that scheduled EVA for tomorrow. For the moment, they just don't know exactly what they're going to have to do about it. So we should have a decision sometime later on today and news to pass on later today about the scheduled spacewalk from Columbia tomorrow morning. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Threatens to delay or cancel a scheduled spacewalk by the Columbia astronauts. KTRH's Doug Miller is at the Johnson Space Center with this live report.
Well, right now it's chow time aboard America's Space Shuttle, but the question is whether one of the astronauts can keep his lunch down. And Bill Lenore told doctors today that he's suffering from motion sickness. It could be a big problem because Lenore and Joe Allen are supposed to walk in space tomorrow morning. Extravehicular activity could be delayed by switching tomorrow's flight plan with Monday's, or the flight could be extended in hopes that Lenore will recover. The flight controllers aren't really talking about it publicly right now, but there is a prospect the spacewalk could be canceled entirely. If the space sickness continues or worsens, that prospect seems to be more likely. A go or no-go decision on the spacewalk could come as early as this afternoon. Meanwhile, preparations for the spacewalk are still scheduled for later this afternoon. Reported live in the Johnson Space Center, this is Doug Miller, KTRH News.
The Texas State Board of Education voted today on the adoption of new textbooks for use in the state's public schools during the 1983-84 academic year.
From ABC News, I'm John Grimes. Sickness or motion sickness, it's all the same. An outbreak of that old enigma threatening tomorrow's spacewalk by Bill Lenore. It could be delayed a day, but no final decision has been made. In Houston, NASA's Tom Holloway.
We'll continue to evaluate the situation through the day and up through, including in the morning, and probably we'll press on with the EVA tomorrow, but if it becomes prudent and we think it would be better to wait a day, the option is there to do that, and we would make that decision first thing in the morning.
Lenore and Joe Allen are scheduled to make the first U.S. spacewalk in 9 years early tomorrow. From ABC News, I'm John Grimes. It has decided to delay tomorrow's scheduled spacewalk by shuttle astronauts Joe Allen and Bill Lenore. Earlier today, Lenore reported he was suffering from apparent motion sickness. This is ABC News.
From ABC News, I'm Bob Windsor. William Lenore is recovering from space sickness and an upset stomach he suffered on Saturday, but mission controllers in Houston decided to play it safe and reschedule Sunday's spacewalk for Monday. Lenore took some hot jalapeno peppers into space with him. He normally snacks on those peppers here on Earth. Space officials say they don't know if Lenore ate any of the peppers, but ABC's John Lyons suggests that even if he did, something else caused his problem.
Space sickness is the biggest medical dilemma facing NASA doctors these days. They say they're having
having no luck predicting who will get it and who won't. They have some tests to find out who is susceptible to motion sickness, and these are given to all the astronauts. But experience shows that once the astronauts get into space, those who weren't affected by motion sickness often get space sick. The disease usually comes and goes in the early stages of a flight and finally goes away for good. It's treated by a drug called Scopedex. NASA doctors would love to get a handle on space sickness to increase crew efficiency and ease a lot of pain. So far, they admit they're not doing so well. John Lyons, ABC News, Johnson Space Center.
Mutual News. By Columbia astronaut Sunday, because of a case of space sickness by crewman Bill Lenore, Flight Director John Cox told a briefing in Houston Saturday.
Bill seemed to be feeling much better, but we just didn't see any reason to push it. We had no reason to... there's no reason EVA's got to be on Flight Day 4 or Flight Day 5 or Flight Day 3, and it just happened to be where it was in the flight plan. So we said, hey, look, guys, let's just give him another day and don't push it.
Columbia's Flight Director John Cox.
CBS News, this is Paul Lockwood. The Space Shuttle is trying to keep busy today to fill up the time which would otherwise have been taken up by a scheduled activity that had to be postponed. Reed Collins at the Johnson Space Center in Houston tells us about that.
Had things gone according to plan, Joe Allen and Bill Lenore would have been outside the spacecraft now doing their spacewalk. But because Lenore wasn't feeling up to par yesterday, the spacewalk was delayed until tomorrow. All four astronauts look and sound chipper today. Looking outside at the cargo bay, Allen sounds eager.
We're looking forward to going out there tomorrow. It looks like it needs some dusting and cleaning.
Well, we can't wait for that activity either, and we'll be with you early in the morning to get started on that.
Today is a fairly light day. More work with the student experiments on board and some repair attempts at a bulky display unit are on tap. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center.
This record was set today by the two Soviet cosmonauts who have been in orbit aboard the Salyut 7 space station for 185 days now. The two broke the old record set in 1980 by two other Russian cosmonauts.
Be walking in space today. We'll have a live update on the shuttle flight after a look at weather with John Greshak. Around the spacewalk today, even though astronaut Bill Lenore says he's feeling better. With more on the flight of Columbia, here's KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino live from Johnson Space Center.
The spacewalk is now on for tomorrow, and it looks very, very well at this point. Bill Lenore, as Lana mentioned, is feeling an awful lot better. Hopefully that will maintain itself throughout the afternoon. This morning, though, the crew turned attention to student experiments on board, the examination of crystals and sponges in zero-G. Mission specialist Joe Allen was also slated to spend about an hour on a study of convection in zero gravity.
Joe, could you give me some estimate on how long it'll take you to get the convection experiment set up? Well, never having done it, Bob, I don't know. Are you looking at trying to get TV? Yeah, we've got a young scientist by the name of Scott Thomas up here in the Mocha with us now that's might interested in seeing that, but just don't want to interfere with your flow. Oh, I understand that, and as soon as we finish the first pass, I'm going to start on the experiment, and with every AOS, I can give you a report even if we don't have a visual on it. Okay, mighty fine, Joe. I'm glad the expert's there, though.
Joe Allen currently on TV pictures we're seeing down here at Mission Control Center, playing around with the experiment, showing the folks on the ground how it's all done up in space. Again, the big show tomorrow morning, the spacewalk, the first one in nearly 9 years. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Where your head wants to float off the pillow. Lenore developed a bad case of motion sickness yesterday and spent most of the day trying to get back in shape. The illness forced a one-day delay in the spacewalk that he and Joe Allen were to take this morning, so the Monday schedule, originally planned, is being played today. Some of that has to do with just straightening up the cabin for landing on Tuesday. If Lenore is well enough, and the doctors say he is improving, the trip out of the spacecraft would take place starting at 7 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. Jim Slade, Mutual News at the Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
Things going very, very smoothly on day number 4 of the Space Shuttle flight number 5. Bill Lenore apparently feeling much better this morning. He recovered most of the day yesterday from a rather serious bout with space sickness, a problem that's been plaguing all of the shuttle missions so far. Yesterday, what those folks at NASA said, one of the things they're considering to try to fix the problem is a Russian-designed space gear. It seems that head movements, quick head movements, is what apparently causes the problem with some astronauts. Lenore is feeling better, as he said. The other astronauts, including Joe Allen, who's been very busy at work this morning on the student experiments, they're all feeling very fine. This is a very, very easy day for Columbia. Once they finish the experiments this morning, they'll eat lunch, then just a few more days in this day flight, and then they'll go to sleep very early because they have to get up about midnight in order to prepare for the big spacewalk tomorrow. That will involve Joe Allen and Bill Lenore leaving Columbia and moving around the cargo bay. Allen noted earlier to Mission Control that cargo bay looked rather dusty, and he was ready to get out there and clean it up. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
CBS News, I'm Neil Strasser. Cosmonauts circling the Earth and the Salyut space station orbited into history today by marking up their 185th day in space, surpassing the old record set in 1980 by 2 other cosmonauts. All is well aboard the American Space Shuttle, with astronaut William Lenore now recovered from his motion sickness and ready for tomorrow's spacewalk. With the walk postponed from today, there was time for some complaining from astronaut Vance Brand.
The biggest problem up here is we're always losing things. They float off. You perhaps find them a day later.
Yesterday, there were breakfast eggs floating all over the cabin. This morning, they were having trouble finding the coffee.
Going round and round, but Bill Lenore's stomach has stopped doing somersaults. KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino has detailed in this live report from Johnson Space Center.
The spacewalk is on hold until tomorrow. A barefoot Bill Lenore looked to be recovering from his bout with space sickness this morning. They've been spending much of the day working on student experiments while pilot Bob Overmeyer replaced a TV screen that you may remember blew out after launch. That's the screen Overmeyer will use on landing day, and the repair job was appreciated.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, Bob Overmeyer gets the Repairman of the Week award. We're sure glad to have those 3 tubes when entry time comes.
Yeah, we'll second that.
The first nice thing these guys have said about me on this trip.
One other note, the SBS satellite, which ejected from Columbia's cargo bay on Thursday, last night expired its apogee motor, heading toward its permanent orbit. Everything on the satellite reported A-OK. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Is left for one set.
CBS News, I'm Diane Sawyer. In Moscow.
CBS News, I'm Jerry Landay. Americans in nearly 9 years will apparently take place tomorrow morning, 24 hours later than planned. The walk by 2 astronauts riding the Columbia shuttle was postponed, and one of them, William Lenoir, was afflicted with motion sickness after breakfast yesterday. According to flight director Tom Holloway in Houston, Lenoir's system is apparently been restored to a go condition.
He has reported to us that he is eating well, and he feels like he's hungry, and he's progressing well with his meals. The important thing that he is hungry and he's eating as much as he wants to eat and feels comfortable with the situation.
Lenoir and mission specialist Joe Allen will be testing new $1 million spacesuits in the harsh conditions of space.
News. I'm Carol Pazetsky. Lenore is said to be feeling much better. No more complaints of motion sickness. The space shuttle crew is getting ready for America's first spacewalk in 9 years. Now this.
CBS News, this is Paul Lockwood.
Of the day in Moscow's Red Square, where moments ago the casket bearing the remains of Soviet President Brezhnev was lowered to its final resting place in a tiny burial area near the Lenin Mausoleum. Mary Wisniewski is standing by right now on the line from Moscow. Mary, what can you tell us? Starting a spacewalk planned for a little less than 3 hours from now by 2 of the Columbia astronauts. Reed Collins reports the latest from the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
A serious hitch has developed in the planned spacewalk by Bill Lenore and Joe Allen. A fan inside Allen's spacesuit refuses to run continuously. Allen and Lenore had suited up inside the airlock that leads outside, and they were preparing the necessary 3 hours breathing of pure oxygen when the fan problem developed. They now have their helmets off again and are checking the unit for water contamination. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center.
$2 million spacesuits went on just fine. Lenore and Allen were 2 hours ahead of schedule in preparing for their first shuttle spacewalk when the warning light in Joe Allen's helmet went off. That apparently is a problem with a fan motor that works only intermittently. From the sound of it, the crew thinks water could be the problem.
I can verify that the fan absolutely stopped running. I put my head as close to the back of his pack as I could, and I could not hear a fan. And on Willie's, I could hear Lenore's fan all the time, no problem. So it was pretty obvious that when those amps dropped off on Joe's, that his fan had just quit. And Roy, a final word. Our feeling is it'll start running for a few minutes if we turn it on again. You might consider foregoing a leak check till we get to a lower pressure. I'm sure if there's not quite such an atmosphere to drag around, the fan just may well work.
Communications interference, as you may hear, have hampered the working effort, and so the crew has had to turn the UHF channels off and go to a different communication system. The astronauts have taken their helmets off, and the crew is trying to work on the problem, and time now becoming a factor. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Along with Ben and Bill. This morning with the Space Shuttle. Actually, the problem lies in Joe Allen's spacesuit. A little fan in those not working properly. And now, officials at NASA may be considering a postponement in that scheduled spacewalk. Joe Allen and Bill Lenore are scheduled to take that walk today. However, because of the current problem, it may have to be postponed. Wayne Dolcefino is at the Johnson Space Center. We'll have a live updated report on the situation for you in our 5:06 newscast.
This time, an electrical problem now is threatening to delay the spacewalks by 2 shuttle astronauts, already postponed from yesterday. A fan in the spacesuit of astronaut Joseph Allen is refusing to keep running, and the astronauts have not been able as yet to begin their scheduled 3-hour period of breathing pure oxygen before stepping out into the cargo bay. Astronaut William Lenore, no longer suffering from motion sickness, is now suggesting mission control might let him go solo.
Looking way ahead here. In the event that we don't get this problem fixed, to give you an hour's anticipation, you might anticipate a suggestion for a short solo.
If it takes place, it would be the first American spacewalk in more than 8 years.
Mike, time is becoming a large factor here because of the idea that they want to get the astronauts asleep by 4 o'clock this afternoon if they plan to come home tomorrow. There's been no discussion yet of possibly delaying the landing tomorrow for 1 day. In order for them to do that, I would think they would have to have some good feeling as to what the problem is. And, as you sit here morning after morning and night after night watching the folks in Mission Control, things have been going so routine. There's been very little conversation between the controllers. At this point, for the last hour hour or so, there have been a number of folks in vested suits standing in front of the EVA console, talking to each other, and most of them have their arms folded and their hands in the pocket, and I think everyone can sort of get a feel for that. That means that they're really baffled. They do not know what the problem is. You can hear over the air-to-ground that the fan is sort of motorboating like a car might motorboat. They think there might be water somewhere in the line, but they haven't found any, and it's so loud that you can hear it over the air-to-ground. Now, Bill and Nora suggested a little while ago, as you heard on CBS, that perhaps they might start looking at the consideration of doing a solar walk. Now, they talked about that when Lenore was sick, the possibility of sending one guy out. There's one difference here. The mission rules, the way we understand them, is that you can do a solar walk if you have the ability to send somebody else out on an emergency basis. And this time we're not talking about an astronaut that can't go. We're talking about a suit that can't go, and there's only one suit on board. Lenore made the suggestion. They didn't seem too thrilled. Then Alan made the suggestion, and here's the conversation from there.
Hey, Roy, following up on that, doing some thinking about that very thought and looking at our flight plan here for the EVA, I would, if we did that, propose that we just do a bare bones to verify the EVA, which in essence would be the aft translation and some of the little dogs and cats. I would not be very inclined to want to put my foot into any foot restraints being the only guy out there.
Yeah, Bill, we caught in. We'll probably not get back to you with this pass with a plan, but we'll certainly talk to you over the stage.
Okay, I'm just hanging here on the wall like a bat. And Roy Vance here, along with everybody else down there, I'm still thinking about this proposal too.
Yes, Vance, we know.
The folks in Mission Control, you could hear it over air-to-ground. They seem to be rather confused, Mike, and the question is now whether or not you can fix the problem. If you can't, whether or not you want to take the chance sending one man out with no suits to back him up. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Space Shuttle Columbia this morning as two of the astronauts prepare for a walk in the void of space. One of the spacesuits has come up malfunctioning. Controllers at the Johnson Space Center are trying to decide what to do now. More from KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino at JSC in the next 20 minutes or so.
Has been called off. We go live to the Johnson Space Center in Houston. John Lyons, what's the latest?
Well, the story is that the two new spacesuits on board Columbia are on the fritz. First, it was Joe Allen's spacesuit. It had a bad fan, and they asked him to take his off, and it was going to be a one-man EVA with Bill Lenore. And then a pressure regulator failed, something like on your scuba diving outfit, and the pressure would not rise to the pressure that they wanted. They have now told Lenore to take off his spacesuit, and the space walk has been canceled for today. Yesterday, the head of the program told us that it would be possible to delay one day and make the mission one day longer if they wanted to. That decision has not yet been made, and it would only be made if they thought they could fix the suits, Bob.
Thank you, John. John Lyons at the Space Center in Houston.
Walk for astronauts Joe Allen and Bill Lenore has now been canceled by the bosses on the ground at the Johnson Space Center. KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino is there and has a live report.
It was one of those sort of Mondays on the Space Shuttle Columbia, the Monday morning that some of us face here on Earth. It was just like that in space, and the spacewalk that was planned, the first one in nearly 9 years, will not come off today. It's been one of those kind of mornings when things have gone from bad to worse. The spacesuits were put on Lenore and Allen at about 3 this morning. Things looked okay until a fan motor in Joe Allen's suit started failing. The alarm went off. The fan sounded like a car needing a tune-up or a new muffler. It made a lot of noise. In fact, so much noise you could hear it on the ground. Then the decision was made about an hour ago to see if Bill Lenore could go it alone. Not for a spacewalk, but for a space peek, just to check and see whether or not the suit could stand the atmosphere out near the cargo bay, just to get the effects of space. But the pressure on his suit, which was supposed to be 4.3 pounds per square inch, wouldn't go that high. The decision was then made a few moments ago to cancel the whole thing, but the Mission Control still wants to see what the problem is with Allen's suits.
And probably the reason we're just wanting to pressurize Joe's suit is just to see if we've got a generic regulator problem or whether we've got a zero-G problem. We just don't know what to do about it right now.
Okay, Bob, I understand. And just for drill, I'm repressurizing my suit in some blind hope.
I understand, Bill.
In Houston, we just got a
Well, as you could hear, one of those kind of mornings in the Space Shuttle Columbia, an unfortunate event in what up until now has been a flawless mission number 5. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
Wire spliced to copper wire. It's not exactly the ideal electrical connection, but that's exactly what happened in the first floor of NASA's Mission Control Building, and that's the vicinity where the fire started overnight on Saturday night. Houston Fire Marshal Eddie Corral suspects that connection is unsafe.
Well, there seems to be a reaction between the copper and the aluminum where if you put the two together, they have a tendency to react and they want to vibrate loose.
This will not have any effect, any severe effect, that is, on today's mission operations. Corral is careful to point out that Johnson Space Center is not within his jurisdiction because it's a federal facility, but he does plan to send an inspector out here just in case NASA wants some advice on its electrical wiring. At the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Buried in Red Square, Israel in mourning for its dead. Valencia continues to speak out. The spacewalk is canceled. Good morning. This is Neil Strasser with the CBS World News Roundup. First American spacewalk in more than 8 years. Astronauts William Lenore and Joe Allen venturing into the cargo bay of the Space Shuttle to test out procedures for later flights. But it was not to be. Yesterday there was Lenore's motion sickness, and today other problems. And the spacewalk for this flight has been canceled. Reed Collins reports from Houston.
There were fatal flaws in both spacesuits. As Joe Allen and Bill Lenore suited up in the airlock, the fan that moves the oxygen in Allen's suit failed.
Very slowly deteriorating. I can hear it clicking. You can probably hear it clicking in the comm, and it's in the process of dying.
Lenore suggested a solo walk on his own, but when he suited up, it was discovered that the pressure in his suit was too low.
If I press my head over to the very far left of my helmet, I can get the gauge up to 3.9. Would that matter?
Good try, but no cigar.
NASA scrubbed the entire spacewalk and began troubleshooting its brand new spacesuit, developed by Hamilton Standard at a cost of $150 million. Reed Collins, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center.
Cosmonauts aboard the Salyut 7 space station are passing their 186th day in space today. Every day, a new endurance record. They surpassed the old record, also set by Russian cosmonauts in 1980, early yesterday.
For astronauts Joe Allen and William Lenore canceled today because of the spacesuit problems they're having. KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino and Doug Miller will have more information on the mission live from the Johnson Space Center. That coming up during the 7:30 news.
Columbia's astronauts. KTRH's Wayne Dolcefino tells why in this live report from the Johnson Space Center.
I've already got some bad news for you. We're going to have to terminate the EVA prep. Bill's suit rig is just regulating too low for us to continue with it.
It was one of those days for the crews of Columbia. Just when everyone was starting to think mission number 5 would be infallible, things fell apart. First, Joe Allen's spacesuit had a noisy and then broken fan, a regulator. And then there was talk of a solo walk, but Bill Lenore's suit wouldn't reach proper pressure. It was a bad day for the astronauts, and a bad day, too, for the folks at Hamilton Standard who made the $2 million spacesuits. Their spokesman is Mark Sullivan.
A lot of NASA people and people from my company and others have worked really hard to have the activity come off this morning, and so, but now we have to go back and find out exactly what went wrong and fix it and go back up on 6 or 7 or 8 and do it.
Once the big show was a bust, the crew did the next best thing, set up a TV show, first of a shaving exhibition, then Joe Allen playing with toys, and then a little sightseeing tour of the Caribbean. And then it was time to think about packing up and getting ready for the trip back home tomorrow. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Wayne Dolcefino, KTRH News.
A fire inside NASA's Mission Control Building this weekend sparked concern from Houston's fire marshal. KTRH's Doug Miller has the story.
Aluminum wiring connected to copper wiring. The Consumer Product Safety Commission decided back in 1975 that it's an often hazardous connection, but that's the way the wiring was hooked up in the area where a weekend fire broke out in NASA's Mission Control Building. Houston Fire Marshal Eddie Corral suspects the wiring is dangerous.
There seems to be a reaction between the copper and the aluminum where if you put the two together, they have a tendency to react and they want to vibrate loose.
Corral is quick to point out that NASA facilities are not in his jurisdiction, but he plans to send inspectors to the Space Center this week to find out if NASA needs any help or advice in its electrical wiring. At the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
CBS News, this is Charles Osgood. During the current mission of Space Shuttle Columbia, the reason neither of the $2 million spacesuits brought along for the job is functioning properly. As astronaut Bill Lenore informed Mission Control from space, the problem with one of the suits was a faulty ventilation fan.
We ran the fan, as you said, with the helmet on the no vent flow port from the SCU.
Vibrate loose.
Corral is quick to point out that NASA facilities are not in his jurisdiction, but he plans to send inspectors to the Space Center this week to find out if NASA needs any help or advice in its electrical wiring. At the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.